I'd like to start with a few complaints. The dinosaur thing, it wasn't appropriate. Although it's true. It possibly is reviewable. It should be. And on that topic of it should be, what I want to tell you today is pretty subjective, and it'll be about where I think we should be going, and hopefully I can tell you why. The other two complaints are, one, that Nicola started about the Constitution and accountability, and I thought, I'm obviously in the wrong place. This is a sport conference, isn't it? We don't believe in the Constitution, we don't believe in accountability, and that's part of the problem why we need a real rule of law type approach, I would say. The last complaint is that Nicola left out when it came to famous people, Marius Herto, who's at the back, who's one of my heroes. Not only because of who he was as a rugby player, and because he helped me once in a dispute when I had no chance and he let my client off, but also because his surname is Herter. And I've always thought, for a Springbok prop to be called Herter, that has to be the most amazing thing of the lot. Then, and I am under pressure because of the timing, because we want to have a proper panel session, I've got notes for myself. My wife said, don't babble, but I'm going to have to babble to get through this quickly enough that Andre doesn't chase me off the stage. A second note, and this is for Andre, and I think Rochelle might be here. You guys must keep writing and working, and Professor Kino, because we need the help. And when I was a young lawyer trying to find my way in sport where there weren't many lawyers, I needed you guys, and I didn't feel so alone because of you. So keep doing the work. My background, which may have maybe of some interest when it comes to not being a lawyer, but what I've seen and the facts in my environment. I'm a Belleville boy, so I never knew anything about football until I fell into it in the Coetzee case and before that. But originally I was a screaming lefty, an Irish beginner. I thought an Irish African beginner, and I only acted for players. You know, I'd make a spitting sound over clubs. No, I would never act for clubs. Then I sold out completely, which benefited me tremendously. And I started acting for clubs. And then later, I joined the league about 10 years ago as the legal counsel, the ultimate sellout, which was wonderful. And I sit for the league on the World Leagues Association, which does tell me some interesting things about the conduct of people in professional sport, I can assure you. The subjective part of it is governance. We need to move towards and protect a rule of law type approach in sport. That includes administrative justice with the work that needs to be done, and Professor Kino is dead right that we need to do more work on the ambit of administrative justice in sport. The levels decisions are made, and often that isn't clearly distinguished in the cases. But we need to go forward and not go back. Not go back towards the kind of approach that was common in football when I started, and believe you me, at the international level, at the national level, even at the local level, there are plenty who want to go back to secrecy, want to go back to abuse of players, and unless we have legal controls, we will go back. So let's not pretend. If you think we won't, that's because you haven't been in that environment. Years ago, many of you will know about this recent Diarra case, which everyone says, it's the new Bosman. It is an important case, but it may be worth you reading. There's a book I read many years ago, The Sporting Exception in European Law, Parish and Meetonen. I can send it to you, or a reference to it if you want. And Professor Weatherall wrote an introduction to that, and he said the following, talking about not just so much a question of administrative justice, but no respect for the law. That's where sport was. And if you don't accept that, then you buy into this idea that they should be entitled to make entirely private decisions and conduct themselves in a way I will explain I experienced. What he said as follows in the introduction. In general, sports governing bodies remain wearingly reluctant to engage seriously with the need to demonstrate intellectually durable reasons why their structures and practices should be treated as necessary and therefore compatible, this is in Europe, with EC law. Even today, they frequently complain about having to do what every other commercially active party has to do, comply with the law. Sport is special, they declare. So it is, but not that special. And that is the thing to remember, because going backwards, believe you me, will take you just something if you're a participant, a player, you don't want to be part of. I should say, just for myself, I want to start by saying that I used to be very certain I was a lefty. I knew the answers to everything. I'm not certain anymore. I'm now filled with doubt about many topics. Sorry, I'm going mad here. That I used to think I knew about. So, for instance, we've got to look at the kind of governance, the level we're talking about. There's a big difference between the role SAFA plays, FIFA plays, the league plays. You need to look at those things and not just assume they're all the same. That's part of the work I think Professor Kino is talking about. To what end? I'm very proud to be in professional football, let's say at the league, not necessarily all the decisions we take and the things that we do, but if you look at what professional football is in this country, it's remarkable. People built a sport against the state, really, under apartheid. If you look at it now, it provides jobs and careers which weren't there before, makes a massive contribution to the economy. It's important. And when I think to myself, what is the end? What is the end of governance? It's trying to protect and improve that. I think that's important. Initially, I thought, if you'd asked me many years ago, should sport be regulated publicly by government, I would have said yes. I was a lefty. But then you look around, you look at parastatals and so on, you look at sports where there are statutes like boxing. That's now true in horse racing, and they're an utter disaster sometimes. I don't know much about horse racing, but certainly boxing. It's got a very good statute, but the statute isn't applied. So I'm not sure about that anymore. Well, in fact, I'm sure. I know it should be private, but private subject to the rule of law, subject to administrative justice. Independent directors sounds a good idea. I'm not certain about that either. And I can give you factual examples if you want to ask about that later, of how that worked in professional football. Perhaps you need people with skin in the game, perhaps you need a mix. There are people here who can comment on that. Even the notion, we were at a sports law conference, is there such a thing as sports law? I originally thought very definitely, and I thought I was the hero, the dinosaur, as Andre says. But in fact, I've moved away from that. Why? Because of this risk of sports law can become something which is just recognition of unlawful and unacceptable conduct. It's a bit like Eben asking, well, FIFA says you can't do this. I'm not really interested to some degree in what FIFA says. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a while. And certainly, as Professor Kino said, we're not really interested in South Africa if FIFA says you can't go to court. They don't really say that, Eben. They say it in certain contexts. But, and to quote the person who you could read, Google Andre and look at some of his articles on these topics, and I think you'll see what I mean there, in the sense of sport not complying with the law. But someone Andre quoted many years ago, and I then followed up, was a Ken Foster, professor in the UK. And he wrote this, and he thinks of himself as a sports lawyer. He said, global sports law, a dangerous smokescreen that justifies the self-regulation of international governing bodies and obscures the danger that their customs and practices will be accepted as legitimate. And that was true when I got into sport. Basically, it was they will do what they like, and then they will find ways to justify it and explain it away. So I actually now believe the law in relation to sport, a particular area of endeavor, but I don't believe in sports law as a very specialist, discrete area anymore. Internal dispute resolution, I was a big believer in that. You'll see I wrote an article, which is, I think, at the bottom of the page, and I was a big believer, and I worked hard at setting up the tribunals in professional football. I'm not so sure anymore how effective they've been, whether they will continue to work. And again, you can ask me about that later if you want to. If you read the article, thoughts from the deepish south, I was very naive then. I believed I was going to solve the problems of the world. I think I created more problems than I solved. But we can talk about that. And then the next thing, which does link with what Professor Kino said, is there's different levels. This generalizing about these things is quite dangerous. I mean, a different approach should be taken to SAFA and within SAFA. A different approach, let's say, to the NSL and within the NSL. Sometimes you're talking about disciplinary committee, sometimes a dispute resolution chamber, sometimes it's a decision of the board of governors or the executive committee. These things are different. But just to I know I probably sound jaundiced. I am from my past. That's what happens to dinosaurs. They get sick and die. But how did I get involved in this? So if you look at, I mentioned some names there, Matthew, Simon, Andre, players that I met. Back in 2000 and 2001, the administrative decision we are talking about was that when players' contracts expired across the board, other than if they were in the few progressive clubs out there at the time, the club would just hold back their clearance, and they'd wait until someone paid enough money at the entire discretion of the club for that player. So he couldn't play. So when I went up, I didn't understand anything about football. I'd go up to these disputes, there'd be queues of players down the stairs, and people basically bidding for these players, and many of them lost their careers and never played again. That's the administrative decision you're talking about. So we mustn't be naive and think they wouldn't do this if they were, they wouldn't go back to that. They will. FIFA is currently going back to that in ways I will describe, different contexts. But it's this continuous kind of interplay between we want to be secret, we want to do things on our own, we don't want the law to apply, and something different. At least that's what I believe. And when I got involved initially, it was chaos. So just so that you get some sense of it. I mean, if there was a dispute and a player would be charged with breaching a FIFA rule, and then a SAFA rule, and an NSL rule, and if you said, well, which one applies? No, they all apply. And if they contradict each other, well, they'll choose the one that applies, and the tribunals would go along with it. That was common. When I initially got hold of the SAFA, then the CEO, who was a lawyer, and said, well, I'm representing Matthew Booth, he was an under-23, he was the under-23 captain, and the Olympics were coming up. He said, are you a player? I said, no. And he said, well, I said, can I have the Constitution because there's an appeal? He said, no, you're not a player, you can't have it. So, well, can Matthew have it? No, he must just come to the hearing. You'd get there, you wouldn't be allowed to speak, neither he nor his lawyers weren't allowed. And it was an attitudinal thing. At that time, the quote I've put there at the bottom, there's no obligation on any footballer to play professional football. That's what organised football said in the Counsel case. Don't come and worry us with these problems. If you don't like it, don't play. Don't play our game. I was never too sure who the our was. My younger brother is waving at me, telling me 10 minutes is already up, and I'm under a lot of pressure, so I'm babbling really badly. But basically, that was football in South Africa. I then started to look at international case law, knew nothing about it. I thought, well, under apartheid, FIFA banned South Africa, so they must be good guys. They must be progressive. No, they weren't. Not so much. They were worse. And if you read a bit about it at the time, you'll find their attitude was, we do what we like. No court, no law anywhere impacts us. After the Bosman case, they then made some limited changes, but kept on trying to go back. More recently with the whole Blatter, these scandals and criminal prosecutions, again, a couple of steps forwards, they're going back. From a governance point of view, some of the safeguards that were put in place for professional leagues, like they had a stakeholders committee brought into being to see administrative justice of a sort. You can just debate changes to fixtures. They've canned that, gone back to having all their buddies come on gravy train trips. The international match calendar, which is essential. You can only play so many games in a year. They're canning that. They're undermining it every day. And it's not just FIFA. So for me, administrative justice there and the rule of law, it's not only important for the league and for SAFA, it's vis-a-vis FIFA. Although a very bright man told me, Michael, we can't litigate every day, and I know that's true. And a lot of this is about power. But we need to understand the possibilities of challenging FIFA. And as I'll show you, according to Judge Unterhalter in Ndoro, we can, when their conduct affects us in South Africa. I mentioned the Bosman ruling. Another academic was my hero, was Professor Blom-Paul, who I spoke to at the time in relation to the Counsel case. He wrote a book talking about the abuses I mentioned towards players. I was then nominated to sit on a FIFA tribunal. I went there. It's no exaggeration to say that while we were being addressed by an international lawyer, people were having hamburgers and smoking cigars and shouting over the top. Those were the kind of people who were appointed to those tribunals. It's no exaggeration. And each time, there's been a step forward, we go back. And at the moment, an issue, a very topical issue, is that of the fixtures in the international match calendar. There were some internal voices, even at the CAS level. CAS is the highest court in sport, has a checkered history. There are big debates about its independence. But in 1994, in the USA Shooting Stars case, CAS even had enough and said, look, come on. You've got to have clear rules. You can't have this rule, that rule, the other thing. To demonstrate what I'm saying, that happened locally. It even happened at CAS. But that wasn't really listened to. And in the end, for me, the top quote about the international sports governing body being peculiar and frightening was written by Andre. It was spot on. I've already told you what Ken Foster had to say. And really what I think we've got to move towards, all of us, if we care about athletes, if we care about our sports, we have to do the work that Professor Kino spoke about, but we have to insist that there's a rule of law approach in sport. Rule of law, core principle being that the sports governing bodies are subject to the law. They're not some sort of Leviathan type Hobbesian thing that can pass the laws and they're not subject to them. They've got to meet basic rule of law principles like accessibility of their rules, applying the rules equally, protecting fundamental rights, and so on. Foster wrote an excellent article which people didn't seem to have taken on very much, but he talked about that concept within sport, and that was the only way these governing bodies could be accepted effectively. Lon Fuller, I won't go through that, but it's worth reading if you want the slide, or get Lon Fuller's book. He contrasts the rule of law approach to what he calls the managerial approach, where I'm in charge and I can do favors. I want rules, so if I don't like you, I can charge you and say, it's not me, it's the rules. But I can do you favors and I can create patronage, and it's a wonderful thing. And given the chance, that's where private sporting governance goes. In South Africa, Clive Plaskett, in 2016, along with people like André, were writing about this, and Plaskett wrote, and he's now a judge of the SCA, wrote an article about we need to have administrative justice in sport. They're making decisions that can have terrible consequences, and we need to see the rule of law, as I like to put it. Just by the way, in Europe, so when we look at one case, this recent Diarra case or the Bosman case, there's a curve. It's not just about individual issues. In Europe, the European courts are saying, look, enough of this. You were special. They recognized certain special features in early on cases like Walgrave, but step by step, they're saying, look, you're not that special. When you pass rules that step outside the bounds of what you're entitled to do as a sports governing body, they will be unlawful. If you make decisions that step outside those bounds, that'll be unlawful. I'm not going to take up much more time. Just the Mphahlele decision, I love that decision. The newspapers and everybody focused on it because of the impact on Ajax Cape Town, which was horrific. But in that case, Mphahlele J looked at the particular context, and he said, right at the end of it, and the bit I like, which I must read actually, is he said, yes, Padja applies, and I agree that one has to look at cases as they arise. For Professor Kino's wish that we should distinguish to happen, then there would have to be buy-in from government and changes in the law perhaps. But in this case, the last quotes, which I love, and I keep telling people in professional football, and they don't seem to really like it as much as I do. He said, in my view, therefore, FIFA, SAFA, and the NSL, though private associations enjoy regulatory powers that discharge public functions, and when they do so remember FIFA, their actions amount to administrative action undertaken by juristic persons in terms of the empowering provisions of their statutes and regulations. This renders such actions open to scrutiny by way of judicial review under Padja. Whether it's only Padja or its legality or is another question. But their decisions have to be subject to law and subject to administrative justice. I won't bore you with all of this. We have an understanding of where this is going in South African professional football, and we follow the outcomes of these cases. There have been a number of cases of late involving professional football. You can see some of them there. The third bullet down, Polokwane, I loved. because that was a case where then Deputy Judge President Sutherland said, come on, it was a review, but he said, this idea that you can mix and match, so referring to the FIFA rule, the SARF rule, he said, no, look, come on, let me get real. It's the direct rule that applies. If you're subject to that rule as a player, for example, then that rule applies. You can't have the dispute being about any rule that you feel like. I think that the reaction in South Africa of the league, I'm not talking for myself now, I'm talking about other people, in trying to follow these cases and develop processes has been exceptional. It's not common around the world. It's not common at all levels, even in Africa. So what does the league do today? I'll just tell you quickly. So there's a pyramid structure, as Judge Untalt has said. It's hierarchical, but it doesn't mean subservience. It doesn't mean we just do everything they say. Our rules also apply directly, which I think of as a subsidiarity principle. Other than that, we're a private association, so you know something about us. You can look at the NSL website and see the NSL handbook. That in itself has issues, which we won't discuss today, or I'll be shot. Players, they contract in. It's a contract of adhesion. So it's important also, when you're talking about administrative justice, for example, or the Constitution, players are not the same as other members. Other members sit in a room like this and vote on the rules. Players are, buy into something that they don't have any choice over. And that has consequences for the way in which disputes involving them are treated. There's an elected executive committee. It's in bold because it's coming up next month, which is quite interesting. They've got a range of powers. It's important, I think, rolling out this rule of law approach for myself is we've had occasion to take senior counsel's opinion on this on a number of occasions. They have fiduciary duties. And they need to be told that and reminded of it. I'm not saying they don't, but if you're standing for election, you need to know that's an onerous responsibility. Often they will talk, people in football, for instance, will talk about the negative aspects of that. You can't act in a conflicted situation, for instance. But there are positives. I'll just quote the last 3 lines of that quote. Talking about fiduciary duties and the attributes of a fiduciary. These attributes boil down to 3 essential characteristics: being deeply informed. How many times have you, I wouldn't know whether you've been into governing bodies in sport, but people often aren't deeply informed. They're not informed at all. They just sit there and go behind the guy with the 10 million. Leon Prince sitting in the back once told me that. Fall in line behind the guy with the 10 million. You've got to be perpetually skeptical. Listen, ask questions. And collegially independent. Each is important, each reflects a complementary perspective, and each allows for an evolving complexity, new situations, different demands. Whether we'll get there on the fixture context and the international match calendar, those kind of things are necessary now. You need great care, you need people who do the work. I'm being told I've got to stop. So I'm just going to tell you a last thing then. That we do have also elements, another area to look at and understand. We have elements that we've tried hard to build in independence. You can talk about executive committees, and you can talk about whether it's appropriately set up and so on. But if you look at the NSL handbook, as I say, it's on the website, you'll see we have an entirely independent prosecutor. Work needs to be done, what exactly that means. What independence means there. But we do have, it is an independent person. We have a disciplinary committee, although it's appointed by agreement between the SAFA president and the NSL chairman, they're all independent people, completely independent. And that's not me just saying it, they are. There's a dispute resolution chamber, it's sort of our version of the CCMA. It hands down written decisions. It's very accessible. There are problems with it, but it's very accessible. The licensing process is run by an independent body. So there is some level of independence built in there, and that should be progressed and worked on. So for me, what are the crucial issues? We've got to work towards defending, protecting, and enhancing this rule of law type approach, and not going back to the managerial favor-based approach. We've got to remember hierarchy is not subservience. You would be amazed at how many disputes I've been involved in, let's say with FIFA or with SAFA in the past. And basically an affidavit will come in saying, we're the mother body, I hate that word. It's a very dysfunctional mother, if they're our mother. But in will come an affidavit says, well, we're in charge. And I just, please, So because we're in charge, we say what the rule means. And we say your rule is invalid. I mean, it's, we need to sort of stop that. Fiduciary duties can never be psychophancy. It isn't so in the PSL, but I've been involved in many governing type arrangements where that's what it is. Fall in behind the guy with the 10 million. We need to work on administrative justice. As Professor Kino said, look at what is its ambit, look at different levels, look at where there can be an administrative justice type challenge internally, because you can often have internal processes versus going to court. Fixture I'll touch on hopefully, if we get a chance. Fiduciary duty is really important. And then my law, nothing is as it looks. When I went to the PSL, I thought, this is obvious. They'd said to me, could you be the CEO? I'm ready. If you asked me now, I'd run a mile. Everything takes longer than you think. Every solution breeds new problems. I've seen that. Introduce like the DRC and you think it's solving a problem, you just create 50 others. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Very interesting. I think we're going to call our panelists up to the stage. And while we do that, I just want to pick up on one thing that Mike said, is please don't Google me, because I'm afraid of what you might find. So. Okay, everyone, I'm very mindful of the fact that we have this limited time. I just also realized, Michael, we don't have enough chairs. Are you willing to maybe, I'll get a chair up for you just now when I'm done. The panelists have very kindly actually agreed to give me just about 3 minutes. This panel is really, or this session is about how sport should be governed. And I think some very interesting thoughts there from Michael. And I just want to say something very briefly about why good governance is important. And I just kind of let my mind go and just put a few thoughts together, which I'll just briefly mention. It's too early in the day for Shakespeare, but I think we need to realize that sports governing bodies and professional leagues, etc., they are exposed really to the slings and arrows. A few things just that are currently happening in the world that I think going forward might become real risks. The session is about governance and risk management. The first one, Mike, you mentioned the Diarra case, and I think there will be more talk about that probably, whether this will be the new Bosman ruling. We also saw in December in Europe, the European Court of Justice gave 3 very important judgments on competition law. I think it was the European Super League case, the Royal Antwerp case, and the International Skating Union cases. Coming from that, analysts and the commentators there seems to be consensus that in the EU at least, going forward, this whole specificity of sport and the sporting exception, this kind of self-immunization from law, is something that I think sports governing bodies are going to find more and more difficult to do in future. There seems to be an approach, at least from these ECJ judgments, promising that there's going to be a clampdown and much stricter scrutiny on what sports governing bodies do, and also recognition of the broader range of stakeholders now, especially in, well, what used to be called, I think 10 years ago, new media, which is now not so new anymore, but I think there's a proliferation of stakeholders who all are impacted by the decisions, for example, that these organizations make. And just in that context, and I will be brief, guys, is there's also still, I think, the threat, if I can call it that, of these breakaway leagues. Those of us who like our cricket, I mean, many of us, I think, don't realize the significant impact that the IPL initially had, subsequent T20 cricket leagues springing up in Australia, South Africa, everywhere. There is this real risk of how do you protect against third parties who come in with their new commercially driven leagues and the competition that brings. So that's one thing just on the commercial side. Then the potential reputational risk for sports governing bodies. sport is not only a commercial industry. We still, and it's often touted in South Africa, this rainbow nation thing around our rugby teams, etc. It also has significant political, cultural, and social implications. And I think decisions that governing bodies make in respect of such issues and how they respond to, for example, protest action, is something that carries significant reputational risk. A few of those areas, and I'll be brief on this. The first one, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I won't talk about the woke movement, but we've seen what's happened, this agenda, if I can call it that, and I don't want to express an opinion for or against, but it's caused chaos on American university campuses. And we've seen it also in sport. Cricket South Africa, I don't know if there's anyone here from CSA. Do you remember Black Lives Matter, Quinton de Kock refusing to take the knee? How was the response to that? More recently, Paris 2012, the opening ceremony, you'll recall worldwide condemnation about the alleged blasphemy against the Christian faith in the opening ceremony. How do governing bodies respond to those kind of things? Transgender athlete participation in female competitions. Leah Thomas swimming in American collegiate swimming competitions. Recently, again, Paris 2012, we saw the transgender boxers, something that made a lot of media, there was a lot of response to that. And then just something that Israel, Palestine. We see protests, widespread protests. The question for me is, when does this spill over into major sporting events that are such fantastic vehicles for these causes to be pushed? Final two, just player safety and liability of sports governing bodies for what happens to players. We see a class action brewing in the UK in rugby. I think there's about 300 players signed up suing the authorities there regarding early dementia caused as a result of injuries. So there, the rule makers, the guys who write the rules of the game, potential risks for them. The final one is in the conflict that we see in the world today, Russia, Ukraine, what's happening in Israel. My question is, and I hope it doesn't happen, when are we going to see a repeat maybe of the 72 Munich Olympics? And terrorism at major sporting events. So safety at these events, another risk area for governing bodies. So that's my story. I just want to bring in the why. How should sport be governed? These panelists will tell us and give us their ideas. I just want us to bear in mind, why should sport be governed well? Okay, so to run this, I'm going to start off just asking whether any of you have any specific questions or comments on Michael's.
Start with a comment. Sorry, is it on?
Thank you.
Good morning, all. You mentioned Israel, Palestine. I just thought it would be interesting to make mention of, we all know what happened with the South African cricket under-19 captain when he made a comment. And sorry, the aim is not to offend anybody. I'm not taking sides, I'm just making a simple comment. And he was ultimately stripped of his captaincy because Cricket South Africa mentioned that they had received threats of protest and of violence at the World Cup games. Now, obviously, the legal issues you have to look at there is, we all know that Section 16 of the Constitution obviously gives David Tiga the right to freedom of expression. But now that has to be looked vis-a-vis the limitation of that right in Section 36. That's to say, although he's got the right to freedom of expression, can that right be limited under the circumstances, also looking at the risk factors that, there would have been, or there were threats that, people were going to protest at games, and obviously the safety of fans and all other stakeholders had to be looked into. So the question that begs is, was Cricket South Africa justified in stripping him of his captaincy for the safety of, of all? That's the question that begs.
Very good point. I actually forgot about that case. Faffa, can I just ask maybe from your side, because Mike didn't have enough time really to give us a proper, I think, anecdotal kind of evidence of the things he's seen that's been done wrong. But your experience, I mean, you've been sitting on sports organizations boards for some time. What the kind of things that you see that haven't worked or doesn't work?
Yeah, thanks, Andre. I must say, I think I should rather try and provide a response to Michael's points than some examples, because the examples, there would be many, but in the interest of time, I think that the key to resolving the risks that you talk about, Andre, and getting the sports industry into accepting the rule of law and fairness into their decisions starts with the appointment of the right leadership at a sports body. It starts with the appointment of that board of directors. And it depends on how that board of directors is composed. That's the starting point. And what I would like to share with you is the example of the New Zealand Rugby Union and their board. About a year ago, or maybe a bit longer ago, they appointed a review panel to review the New Zealand Rugby Board's composition and how they are appointed. And they came up with a report after at least 6 months consultation with various parties that is in the rugby industry. And interestingly enough, the report wasn't accepted by the New Zealand Rugby Board. So why would that not be after a highly experienced panel made some suggestions? The reason was it broke up the balance of power in that rugby board. It proposed for members of the current board and the current structures to not be able to represent the leadership of New Zealand Rugby. And maybe a few points, just the panel recommended 9 independent members. And it's not 9 independent members as such, that's the key, but it is how they are to be appointed. They even have to be appointed by an independent appointment panel. So you try to break up the mafia in sports organizations. That power, I think the question after the first presentation had to do with that power that perpetuates, or that mafia that perpetuates, that you can't break up. So they proposed that that an independent appointment panel gets set up. How do they make that panel, how do they constitute that appointment panel? 2 independent members appointed by the Institute of Directors. 1 independent member appointed by the New Zealand Rugby Board. And then 2 members that doesn't have to be independent, appointed by the sports, the rugby bodies, the Rugby Council, in other words, the other representative bodies in New Zealand Rugby. But it's a 5-member, of which 3 are independently appointed, and they then, that panel of 5, get the nominations for board members, and they appoint independent board members, meaning that weren't in the sport in influential positions for 4 years before appointment. That's how you get independence, strong leadership at your governance body, and I think if they were to implement that, watch the space. New Zealand Rugby is going to thrive.
Thank you,
I
Faffa.
think that's it.
Maybe can I come this side, Shane. We've seen an increase in challenges of the regulatory powers of bodies by players, increasing. What are your thoughts going forward on that?
Thanks, Prof. Louw. So it's a good question, and being a lawyer, there's never been a better time, in my opinion, to be a sports lawyer and to be involved in the sports industry. So it's good for us, good for me. I think what we are seeing is a challenge to the system more and more every day. I think Michael spoke to it, is these bodies have lived in an era where they believe they are incredibly special, they're immune to oversight, and they've enjoyed a period which has allowed them to grow into these superpowers, the likes of FIFA, the incredible power which they have over world football, and they extend their tentacles into all the national federations to an attempt to impose their power. So, in my opinion, I think that we are going to see more and more challenges. Speaking to the exponential line in the graph that Michael mentioned, we're probably somewhere towards the bottom, maybe in the middle, nowhere near the top yet. We're going to see more and more challenges from players associations. Eugene is going to have an interesting time ahead of him. Other player associations, Michael's going to get more knocks on his door from SAFPU. That's a good thing. Players and players associations, they need to stand up and they need to challenge the system. They need to push back against these powers. And we need to achieve this balance, because right now the seesaw is at the bottom for FIFA, and the players are hanging up in the middle of the air on the other side. There's too much power from these bodies, and players are the ones that are suffering. So we see the Diarra case, we see the FIFPro case, and these cases are going to provide some interesting answers to questions we all have right now, is what can these associations and global bodies tell our players to do? How far can they go? And what kind of pushbacks do our players have? So speaking to the fixtures is, without the players, there are no fixtures. So how can these bodies tell these players where they must be at all times? Surely the players need to have more say in that. The Diarra case, very interesting. It speaks to a question that's been asked many times, is can we control these players and their movement as much as we do? What is the balance? So it's a very interesting time for all of us. I'm not sure who made the quote, but when people stop asking questions and people stop talking, conflict happens. So I appreciate this opportunity from the university to bring up these topics. I think we should have more of these dialogues, and I think we should ask the questions in order to understand where we need to go in the future in sports and sports law.
Thank you very much, Shane. Can I just, David, before I get to you, you're in the commercial side, you're in the sponsorship side. I just actually want to come to Michael this side, a leader in sports media. We've had some talk now, or we've heard a lot in the limited time. We've heard a bit about football. We've heard about something from the rugby side. You have, I think, broad experience in a number of sports. I think you just golf also. You just came back from the Alpha Daniel, I think. St. Andrew's beautiful, eh? But so maybe from your side, what are your experiences over the years in terms of when it comes to maybe decisions you've investigated or seen bodies taking or maybe not taking, or whatever the case may be?
Well, I used to actually think that, lawyers and journalists didn't have anything in common, and I think we actually do, because I now realize nobody likes us. It's least of all the federations and teams and so on, because we ask questions. And, I think I agree with my fellow panelists that it is an exciting time for sports law, and I think it's ripe for it. And I think if I look at the media evolution, as journalists, we fought for access, basically. That's what it is. You fight for access to those federation meetings to ask those important questions. And, as Faffa also said, there is a mafia. I think Michael Murphy also mentioned it. If they could go back, they would, because teams like secrecy, unions like, internalizing things. If I look at the two legends in the room here, I started covering pro sport at the Pretoria News when I had hair like Andre, and I covered Marius Hertz's career. In those days, if you wrote something the coach didn't like, he banned you. You didn't come to the games. You got banned from press conferences. You couldn't go to training. They were closed trainings. Your media just couldn't attend, no matter what you did. Nowadays, I work with Skulk Brits, and we go to his house, and we film content with his family, and he braais for us, and he braais exceptionally well. It's a completely different environment. It's way more open now, and I think that's because the landscape has moved on so much in the sense of media. It's become more open. There are still teams that struggle with that. The DHL Stormers, John Dobson welcomes it. You're in the change room if you need to be as official media and things like that. Vodacom Bulls, Jake White, he's still a little bit old school and doesn't like too much of that. But I do think, the way that media has evolved and gained more and more access now, it's unprecedented, the access we can get to teams, especially if you work with sponsors. They open a lot of doors that teams before would love to have kept closed. And I think the sports law is going to get there as well, because it's just going to move so much further along that it's going to become a necessity. So I do think it feels to me like it's a question of access, and I don't think it's going to be stopped, especially with the rise of individual player power. The players are holding more and more of the cards, and I think as a result of that, you're going to get more and more business.
I think, Michael, that's good to hear. For me, that's some of the best news I've heard today about the access, and I think it's important when we talk about governance and the kind of principles that Michael mentioned, that, we guys need you, firstly, to have access, and for accountability in these organizations, it's important that you can see what's going on in there. So, David, from your side, you mentioned now from the sponsors, helping them, for example, to get in the media, get in your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Ooh, sorry about that. I guess as the non-lawyer in the room, I didn't have a brother to come with me. I normally bring my accountant with me with a stopwatch when I get in a room with lawyers. But our job really is to make sure that it doesn't get to you. And so the commercial viability is at the core of everything we do. So just a couple points on how we do that, and really indirectly, what are the consequences of some of the actions and the legal drawings and all the rest of it. And so when you say, the power of the journalist and the power, today everybody's a journalist. If they have a cell phone, they're now reporting. We have social media, we have technology. This is the most exciting time to be in so many industries, and in broadcast and in sport and in sponsorship, because it's changing at the speed of light. And how we do contracts and commercial around that, it's changing so quickly that we can, it's challenging. What is a broadcast right today? What is a platform? What is a media? Are you allowed to speak on it or not? What clothing is the guy wearing when he speaks on it, and which hat is he wearing? So I picked up a few little points from before, and the first one was, too much a matter of feel, was a quote. And that's problematic to anyone in commercial. If it's too much of a matter of feel and I'm dependent on making commercial, so that this sport exists, so that the sponsors get their value, so we're not in breach of contract, so we can deliver on rights negotiation, our job is to make the commercial side watertight and let the law take care of itself. We talked about governance. Boxing South Africa promulgated now directly under the Minister of Sport. Now we can argue whether that's right or wrong, and I don't think this is the platform, and I was involved in it at the time. What I can simply say is, when I put on my research cap now, we've tracked who watches and plays sport for the last 30 years, since 1987. If I go back before boxing was promulgated, and even the 10 years before it was promulgated, it was on a downward slide. And for a number of reasons, not just administration and others. But boxing was the #2 sport, spectator sport in South Africa amongst black men and women. Second only to soccer. It's now nowhere close to being in the top 10. And when your appointments are done when boards are put into place, independent or otherwise. I was thinking New Zealand, and immediately I brought back visions of Cricket South Africa and the independent members of that we went through here as well, and it'll continue. If any sport body, federation, doesn't have commercial expertise, doesn't understand broadcast laws, broadcast rights, they've almost lost before the game. And so many of our Cinderella code, smaller federations, be it music, arts, culture, sport, it doesn't matter, they don't even have a lawyer on call. So most of the contracts they enter into, the sponsor's writing, because APSA has a lawyer and Old Mutual does, and they're really good on the legalities, and it's a 240-page contract, but the 7 pages that matter, which are the commercial rights, nobody knows. They've got to call in one of the 6 people in this room that have worked on the last 600 cases because we're auditing whether the commercial values were determined. And so that's part and parcel with where we have to go. We talked about PSL, SAFA, NSL, and the governing. I mean, I go back to 2010 when it all started to change here and we got back on the map. We changed the laws for FIFA. We brought in new rules for ambush law, which arguably were the most draconian in the world. I was recanting yesterday with Western Cape as they were doing their strategy on sport. They were talking about 2010, and we said, we remembered Sepp Blatter coming through the streets in 2009 for the Confederation Cup saying, "I don't see anybody dancing in the streets." And we went to him and said, "Sepp, we're not allowed to. We don't have any sponsors that are paying. They don't have any rights. We're not allowed to mention FIFA. And your sponsors haven't arrived yet. How do we deal with that?" So these are the type of things, to your point, finally, COVID. COVID changed the law, right? And we're still feeling the effects. We had 6 World Cups in a 12-month period. It's never happened before. And how you manage it. We had 3 in this country. We have women's sport. We'll get to all of that stuff later in commercial. That's changing everything. But the power of the individual raised exponentially. So while we're protecting their rights under Big Bad Brother, they're actually usurping the rights and often, in the extreme case, bigger than the federation themselves. And the shift in power and commercial rights, whether you're in America and it's NFL football, to third-party players like betting companies and fantasy football and streaming agencies, actually are making more money than those running the sport itself. And these are all part of what we have to make airtight.
Thank you for that, Dave. Just you mentioned ambushing in 2010, and I remember one of my favorite Shapiro cartoons of all time was the one of, there was a World Cup stadium in the background and these FIFA fat cats walking with a suitcases stuffed full of money, and the one guy was saying, probably supposed to be Sepp Blatter, it was business doing pleasure with you. And I think that makes a good point. Can I just, Mike, before, if we still have time, if anyone wants to jump in, but Mike, what would you say then? If you say there are these problems, and you're not necessarily talking about football just, or the PSL even, but what do you think, if there's one thing that a professional league must do to be successful, what would you say that is?
I'd say all these things. So doing the work to understand what are concepts, rights. If you're going to do things, you want to understand what they are. As Faffa says, I don't know exactly how to stand in the field, but that's our base. But a current risk facing us now, today, in professional football, and this may be subjective, selfish, because I'm talking about the preservation of our league, the jobs it creates, and so on, is this business of the international match calendar. So we're in a hierarchy. There's an international match calendar. That was supposed to be part of the hierarchy. So you've got national games within a box, and then the leagues can have their games. They can develop their fixture. They can give the sponsors, for example, commercial rights around that fixture. That's under threat. It's collapsing. It's going away. Because FIFA is the biggest competitor of the leagues today. So is CAF. They just introduce new competitions. They ignore the international match calendar. They send an email and just change a game overnight. A game which then conflicts with our fixture, then we're not providing the sponsor with what they expect or the commercial partners. The league collapses and all the jobs go. Who knows? Maybe your example, the Indian Premier, maybe something better will come out of it. But right now, we need to hold FIFA to the international match calendar.
Okay, yes, please, Dave. And sorry, guys, yeah.
Sorry, is that on? Yeah. I just want to pick up on Michael's point and put it into a commercial context now, the world we live in. So again, if you go back in history and football hierarchies and who should have control over what, during the apartheid days when everything changed and NSL and SAFA lost rights, one of the fundamental rights that shifted from the mother body to NSL was the Nedbank Cup, which is the FA Cup in European football, to put it in for those that don't know. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters commercially if you have to run a business, because that's a lot of games under your control that garner commercial rights, that broadcasters pay for, that sponsors pay for, to the tune of maybe 100 million, maybe 200 million, whatever the case may be. Now, if you're the mother body and all that you have left is the national teams, and when the national teams play, they're on somebody else's fixture. You don't own the rights unless it's your own friendlies. And if you no longer have any friendlies left, you have 3 games a year that you can commercialize. Now, football has 20,000 clubs. It has, Danny Jordan was famously quoted many years ago saying that the membership of SAFA is bigger than the ANC and COSATU put together. I think that was during an election rally, but the truth remains is it's millions of people that are players that are under that association. The NSL PSL has 32 clubs under its direct jurisdiction and also sits on the various bodies, etc. The money all goes, and they say, Sidenberg, why does the money all go to the PSL? None of it goes to SAFA. Because the commercial rights under your control, largely, the TV rights, the broadcasting, I can't sell 5 games for 50 million to Supersport. And if the games I had are now under FIFA control, and if my travel ban, how many days I can travel between, I can only play locally, I can't even play internationally, or both my home games must be in Paris, they can't be in South Africa. How do you commercialize and fund the entire federation, the mother body, when you have no commercial rights left? And that's the dilemmas we're facing now if we don't step in.
Thank you very much, Dave. We actually are out of time. Can I ask everyone, sorry, Shane, I want to thank all the panelists, and I think with this limited time, I think it's always a problem. You don't get enough time for engagement, so I definitely hope that throughout the day, anyone, if you want to come, and I'm making the offer on behalf of you guys, just to come and speak while we're drinking tea or at lunch or whatever, and kind of get some of the wisdom that's on this podium. I should stand there when I say it, but some of the wisdom of these people. So thank you very much, and Michael also for your presentation, and thanks a lot, guys.